So the Greeks traveled to Egypt and said that the Egyptians were the faultless people. They said that they were the greatest people on earth, the most beautiful people on earth. They went to Egypt, the Greek mathematicians went to Egypt to study mathematics. Pythagoras spent 23 years studying math in Egypt. The Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, was used in Kemet to build the pyramid at least 2,000 years before Pythagoras was born. Hippocrates, the Greek father of medicine, acknowledges Imhotep as the father of medicine. Imhotep was the designer of the step pyramid at Saqqara. The columns that are referred to as Greek columns, you can find them at Saqqara. So the elements of Greek design, Roman design, Greek philosophy, all had their beginnings in ancient Kemet or Egypt. Around 1919, Breasted wrote an incredible book that documented his travels in Egypt and described the ancient Egyptians as dark-skinned people with woolly hair who were not unlike the Nubians who live in Egypt now. Well, this book was called Ancient Times, and it was a favorite book of John D. Rockefeller. He read it to his children all the time. And then Rockefeller decided to fund Breasted, gave him $1.5 million to establish the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. But he also had caveats with that contribution, in that in the second edition of Ancient Times, which was published around 1935, Breasted removed all references to the ancient Egyptians as being dark-skinned people, and he added a new chapter where he said that they were members of the Great White Race. Most of what we know about Egypt is viewed through Greek and Roman eyes. Egypt is a Greek word, Sphinx is a Greek word, pyramid is a Greek word. So until we can begin to interpret this indigenous African culture and civilization through an African lens, then we will always view them from a disadvantage. But there's Reisner, George Reisner, who excavated in Sudan, and so many others who saw the historical truth, saw that black people who have been marginalized in this country and around the world, who have been enslaved because Pope Eugenius IV said that black people had no souls. So people did not look upon us as people who created anything of value. So I can understand how racists would say, oh no, well, these buildings could not have been built by black people. They don't have intelligence. These black people could not have written these great scripts. So they were operating under a false system of white superiority. So when they were confronted with the historical reality, they suffered what's referred to in psychology as an identity quake, cognitive dissonance. You know, they couldn't connect the dots, so they fabricated historical lies. And so the work that we're currently engaged in right now is to tell the truth. We are literally digging up the truth, and the truth speaks for itself.
Reisner's writings about the Kushites are a window into his warped racial beliefs.
Its very race appears to be a product of its poverty and its isolation. A Negroid Egyptian mixture fused together on a desert riverbank, too far away and too poor to attract a stronger and better race.
Even as he was awed by the pyramids he excavated, he refused to believe they could have been built by the ancestors of the black Africans he saw all around him. His prejudices even seem to have clouded his eyesight. In 1916, when he discovered beautiful black granite statues of the great Kushite kings, he argued they were not real likenesses. Instead, he proposed that the kings and the builders of all the Kushite monuments had actually been light-skinned foreigners.
The discipline of Egyptology has its origins with the invasion of Egypt by Napoleon Bonaparte in the late 18th century. Napoleon's army would defeat the Ottoman Empire at a time when European colonism was nearing its zenith. The Ottoman Empire, also known as the Turkish Empire, rose to prominence in the 12th century with the help of the Mamelukes. The Mamelukes, which translates to one who is owned, were an Eastern European population of slave soldiers who overthrew their rulers and came into power. In 1798, Napoleon led the French army into Egypt, swiftly conquering Alexandria and Cairo. The Battle of the Pyramids marked the beginning of the end, 7 centuries of Ottoman and Mamluk rule in Egypt. When Napoleon invaded Egypt, he brought along an army of scholars whose studies during French occupation became the foundation of Egyptology. This field of study was employed to promote the idea of European imperialism. Jean-Léon Gérome's painting, Bonaparte Before the Sphinx, captures Napoleon's instinct that the glory of ancient Egypt could be harnessed to exalt French colonial power.
Many of the early archaeologists came to the study of ancient Egypt and ancient Nubia from the perspective of Semitic languages or the study of the Hebrew Bible, and it was very important to them to bring Egypt specifically into the sphere of biblical studies. And so they had to carve Egypt away from Africa to bring it into that sphere. And the way that they did that was they used race. So these early archaeologists effectively made ancient Egypt white in the sense that they made it part of a dominant Western culture, and ancient Nubia was separated from that. It was black. And this was how they took Egypt out of Africa and put it into this Semitic sphere, this biblical sphere. And so it's imperative that we go back and continually reassess the things that we take as facts.
Western academia's anti-African sentiment has contaminated the fields of Egyptology and anthropology. From their very inception, these institutions have been rooted in racism. In 1912, German archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt discovered the famous bust of Queen Nefertiti in a region of Egypt called Tel el Amarna. It would later be unveiled to the general public in 1923 at the Egyptian Museum of Berlin in Germany, and became the standard of beauty and a cultural symbol for Berlin and Egypt alike. However, the sculpture has been the subject of heated debates, and many scholars have gone on record to question its authenticity. After 20 years of research, Henry Sterren, a Swiss historian, made the shocking revelation that the bust of Nefertiti is actually a fraud. And in the documentary, The Mysteries of the Nefertiti Bust, he lays out the compelling evidence.
What first made the academics suspicious was the exceptional state of conservation of Nefertiti's bust when it was discovered. The object was incongruous. It bore no resemblance to any other 3,300-year-old busts from Egypt. To historian Henri Sterlin, the bust of Nefertiti is simply too well preserved, or, as he puts it, too new to be true. Numerous archaeologists, Americans, Italians, French, have expressed their doubts about whether the bust is genuine, but none of them have made their doubts official. So we've decided to stage our own inquiry. Borchardt is very precise in his notes from the dig. He states he found large quantities of pigment, adding they were all still quite usable. But if this was an experimental copy, how is it Borchardt never spoke of it to his team, nor in his meticulous notes? According to the historian, on the 5th of December 1912, the archaeologist was in Cairo. He learns that one of Germany's princely families is passing through and wants to visit his archaeological digs. Caught unprepared, Borchardt rushes back to Tel el Amarna. He arrives on the 6th of December 1912, which was meant to be a day off for his workers. He immediately sets them back to work. Later, he proudly shows their highnesses the fruits of his labor. In an excess of zeal, one of the dig foremen, an Egyptian called Senussi, disappears briefly during the visit, then returns with a bust of Nefertiti. The royals are delighted with such a masterpiece, and a photograph immortalizes the moment, leaving Borchardt apparently no time to explain it was a copy and not the real thing. Henri Sterlin claims the photo is what trapped the archaeologist. You couldn't just tell the royal visitors who are enthusing over the object, listen, you're mistaken, it's ridiculous. It would make a mockery of the royals. It was simply not possible to tell the truth, or the royals might have been covered in ridicule, and that would have been lèse-majesté, or treason, which at the time was very serious indeed and could have ruined Borchardt's career and life for good.
Check out our apparel line and become part of the Know Thyself family. We have fresh t-shirts, hoodies, and caps to stay fly and represent the culture. All proceeds go towards the funding of future episodes. Log in with us. www.knowthyselfinstitute.com. Support the channel by tapping that like, subscribe, and notify button to be alerted to new content.
I've no doubt in my mind that this is a fake, a copy, a phony.
During the Second Reich, the Germans were coming about with a philosophy to justify further expansion, colonialism and imperialism. And in an attempt to do that, they claimed to be the discoverers of many sets of different artifacts, one of them being this head. But in fact, what it was something created at the time or just afterwards to justify their ideas of colonialism and imperialism.
But this was far from an isolated incident. In 2018, paleo artist Elizabeth Days unveiled a facial reconstruction based on the fraudulent Nefertiti bust, which further Europeanized her features. And in 2005, Dr. Zahi Hawass, Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, announced the results of a digital reconstruction of the face of Queen Nefertiti's son, King Tutankhamun. However, the relief on the back of his royal throne of him and his wife, Queen Ankhesenamun, shows a dark brown skin tone and features that resemble populations found in modern-day Sudan and the Horn of Africa. With discrepancies so glaringly obvious, one has to wonder what other liberties have been taken behind closed doors. A concerted effort has also been made in Hollywood to whitewash ancient Kemet. Television and film have promoted the idea of a European Egypt for decades. But when we look at the temple walls, we see a melanated population with a variety of skin tones and hairstyles, such as afros, waves, braids, and locks. Indeed, the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and translation of the ancient hieroglyphs, originally known as Medu Neter, made Western scholars rethink their narrative. The newly transcribed inscriptions revealed an advanced culture that had attained an exceptionally high level of development. They coined the term Sub-Saharan Africa as a way to separate the genius of Egypt from the rest of the continent.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the study of antiquity and the Middle Ages. As always, I am your host, Nick Barksdale, and today we are joined once again by Dr. Rebecca Futo-Kennedy, who's going to take us through a thought-provoking episode on the term Sub-Saharan and the whitewashing of ancient North Africa.
This idea, this like sort of continually trying to find this idea of, you know, separating out North Africa from Sub-Saharan as if the Sahara was the impermeable boundary that nobody could get through is really a continually problematic type of argument, particularly since we have early texts that tell us that, right, Herodotus tells us that, he says the Ethiopians and the Garamantes are indigenous to North Africa, and that, of course, the Phoenicians and the Greeks are not. But he makes it very clear that people they call Ethiopians are indigenous to North Africa and Northwest Africa in particular, right? But they are not Sub-Saharan. So I constantly, what is the obsession that people have with this idea of Sub-Saharan, that whenever they ask any question, what they're trying to do is prove that Sub-Saharan Africans aren't part of the ancient Mediterranean world, which we know is false. Not only do we know, of course, that people that we would call quote-unquote Sub-Saharan Africans ruled Egypt before the Persians got there, among others, but that they have this continual culture that runs up and down the Nile. And we know from our ancient sources that they believed very firmly, and they interacted with what in the area that they called Libya, right?
Sheikh Anta Diop was a Senegalese historian and anthropologist. He was a firm believer that the ancient Egyptians were in fact black. According to his research, the skulls of ancient Egyptians had physical features resembling the peoples of the Upper Nile region, East Africans, and Nubians, all visibly black populations. But his theories aren't shared by all experts on the matter. We spoke to Dr. Zahi Hawass, an award-winning, world-renowned archaeologist. His life's work has been dedicated to the discovery and research of ancient Egyptian antiquities. Not surprisingly, his office is full of books on the topic, some of which depict dark-skinned ancient Egyptians. But he says there's an explanation.
No, they were dark-skinned,
but they were not black.
But they are not Negro. Because look at the length of the Negroes like that, and the nose like this. It's not really in the Egyptian origin at all. It's different, completely different. And this is why you cannot connect the Egyptian civilization with the African at all. It's different. Or from Syria, Palestine, Mesopotamia, it's different, completely.
During an interview on BBC News Africa, Dr. Zahi Hawass illustrates Egyptology's reluctance to acknowledge Black African presence in ancient Egypt.
When asked about the ethnicity of the ancient Egyptians, he describes them as being uniquely Egyptian.
You cannot make any test. There is some studies to see that the shape of the skull looks like African, but still you will never put a final decision about the origin of the ancient Egyptian at all, because you need really to make a very comprehensive study by DNA, and this will take a long time.
So how African the ancient Egyptians were still remains a matter of debate for some, even if UNESCO scholars now say the matter is settled and that the pharaohs and their people must be placed firmly within the Black African context.
Check out our free virtual museum and digital library. Visit our official website at www.knowthyselfinstitute.com. Support the channel by tapping that like, subscribe, and notify button to be alerted to new content.